Hello and welcome everyone to the second round of the Grid Resilience at PNNL webinar series, which began last fall. My name is Jenny Rice. I am a senior research scientist here at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory in the Atmospheric Sciences and Global Change Division. I am a co-lead along with Dave Judy of PNNL's Climate and Energy Joint Objective, which has for the last 3 years been connecting research silos and integrating PNNL's advanced capabilities in climate science, social sciences, and power grid planning and operations to provide critical insights for grid resilience and equity under the clean energy transition. As part of this effort, I'm excited to introduce a new webinar series entitled New Capabilities for Climate and Equity-Informed Energy Resilience Planning. Specifically, this new series will showcase our grid operations, decarbonization, environmental, and energy equity platform, also known as GODEEEP, as well as the datasets and tools readily available to help planners, operators, investors, scientists, and the public take steps toward deep decarbonization. Today, we present our kickoff webinar, providing an overview of GODEEEP. We will follow this with 4 deep dive webinars every 2 weeks on Mondays at this same time. The deep dive webinars will provide detailed descriptions of the science behind the capabilities you will hear about today and show you how to access and use tools and data sets based on a range of technical questions, from high-level planning to siting and sizing of assets. At each session, technical leads will address questions and be able to provide assistance with the platform. We will have time today for Q&A, as well as in each of the deep dive webinars. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our 2 speakers for today, Nathalie Voisin and Stephanie Waldhoff, who are the co-principal investigators of GODEEEP. Nathalie Voisin is Chief Scientist for Regional Water Energy Dynamics in the Earth System Predictability Group at PNNL. She leads and contributes to multi-institutional projects for the U.S. Department of Energy, fundamental and applied science offices, where she acts as subject matter expert for water energy integration challenges. Dr. Voisin also works with international governmental agencies and industry on transitioning water energy research into operations as part of international industry information exchange platforms. She holds a dual appointment as Associate Professor with the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department at the University of Washington and is a co-author of the 5th National Climate Assessment for the Energy Chapter. Dr. Voisin joined PNNL in 2010 after completing a PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering from the University of Washington. She also holds a Master of Science in Atmospheric and Oceanic Sciences from McGill University in Montreal, Canada, and a Bachelor's and a Master's in Engineering in Hydraulics and Fluid Mechanics from the ENSET Engineering School in Toulouse, France. Stephanie Waldhoff is a Senior Research Economist at PNNL's Joint Global Change Research Institute in College Park, Maryland. Her research focuses on the long-term effects of climate change as they relate to the economy. Dr. Waldhoff's work has a particular emphasis on feedbacks between the climate and economy, interactions between climate change impacts and mitigation policy, and the implications of these on measures of human well-being. She has extensive experience developing and using multi-sector dynamics modeling to inform decision-making. She has served on the Scientific Steering Committee of the Integrated Assessment Modeling Consortium from 2014 to the present, and has been an advisory board member on multiple international research projects. Dr. Waldhoff also holds a joint appointment with the University of Maryland's School of Public Policy. Prior to joining PNNL in 2012, Dr. Waldhoff was an economist in the United States Environmental Protection Agency's Climate Change Division. There, she led the division's long-term integrated assessment modeling and estimation of the economic damages from climate change impacts. She received her BA and PhD in public policy from the University of Chicago. And with that, I'm happy to turn it over to Stephanie Waldhoff, who will get us started with this kickoff webinar. Stephanie, you are muted.
Thank you, Jenny. As I was saying, thank you, Jenny. And I want to thank everyone for attending our first webinar on the Grid Operations, Decarbonization, and Environmental and Energy Equity Project. We're really excited to share the work that we've done and appreciate everyone's time in coming. I want to note that Natalie and I are presenting on behalf of a large team here at PNNL. So Natalie and I are going to be tag teaming for this presentation. First, I'm going to present the motivation for the research. Then Natalie's going to share the GODEEEP research structure, including the platform, data, and workflows and end use cases. We'll give you a brief introduction to the topics of the deep dives on the specific research area that we're going to highlight that are coming up over the next 2 months. We'll highlight some connections with DOE programs and then open for a question and answer. So keeping global average temperature change to under 1.5 degrees Celsius requires transitioning economies to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Achieving this is going to require roughly 45% decrease in global emissions by 2030, with a full transition to net zero by 2050. While 193 countries have committed to this goal under the Paris Agreement, we are not currently on track to achieve it. The Glasgow Climate Pact called for countries to strengthen their nationally determined contributions and to take immediate action toward emissions reductions. The United States long-term strategy to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 requires emissions reductions of 50% below 2005 levels in 2030, which is a much steeper trajectory than what we're currently on. PNNL staff contributed to the long-term strategy using the PNNL's Global Change Analysis Model, or GCAM, which is one of the foremost integrated human Earth system models in the world, one of 2 models used to develop the long-term strategy. So analyses using both GCAM and NEMS showed that to achieve this goal, it's going to require major increases in electrification across all sectors, particularly transportation, while simultaneously decarbonizing electricity generation. Any remaining emissions would likely need to be offset with carbon dioxide removal technologies. These massive changes to the way we use and produce energy will have implications beyond power generation. Consumers are also going to be heavily impacted through these transitions to widespread household electrification and transportation, along with potential increases in energy prices. So in addition to utilities and regulators determining how to achieve this goal, another major question that needs to be addressed is how we can achieve these dramatic goals in a resilient manner, producing safe, affordable, and reliable electricity for all consumers. Both federal and state decision makers are requiring that impacts to traditionally disadvantaged community, or DACs, as we're going to refer to them, be taken into account in the implementation of this transition. Nearly half the states have adopted some form of energy equity related measures. Some of these measures are specific, such as caps to increases in bills due to renewable portfolio standards, but others are more vague, such as requirements that utility regulators consider equity in their decision-making. But it's worth noting, looking at this map, that DACs are not only poor urban or poor rural areas. This map shows how widespread disadvantaged communities are across the United States. So these requirements are based on historical disparities for disadvantaged low-income and minority groups. The figure on the right shows the stark comparisons between exposure to PM 2.5, just as an example. People of color have higher than average exposures to PM 2.5 emissions from 11 of the 14 industries examined here, while white residents have more exposure than average for only 2 sectors. So the major changes needed to decarbonize the economy are going to affect emissions in all of these sectors. in addition to water pollution, soil pollution, and noise pollution, electricity outages, affordable energy, and access to clean energy. So it's really vital that we understand how these transitions are going to impact different people and when and how. So understanding the full implications of decarbonization means that we need to analyze the impacts on both supply and demand side. Both providers and consumers will be greatly impacted by the major energy transitions needed to achieve a net zero economy. There's many uncertainties associated with these transitions, and understanding all of the impacts requires a framework that can simultaneously explore both sets of changes across multiple scales and outcomes. And now I will turn it over to Natalie.
Thank you. So as Stephanie was saying, if you go to the next slide, thank you. Addressing decarbonization of the power grid and electrification of sectors under climate change conditions and worsened extreme events with impact on both providers and consumers required an established and balanced expertise in climate science, social science, and power system engineering, aka multi-sector dynamics. In this $4 million initiative called GODEEEP, PNNL is building on those expertise demonstrated through leadership in the Department of Energy Fundamental and Applied Science offices. GODEEEP stands for Grid Operations, Decarbonization, Environmental, and Energy Equity Platform. What GODEEEP provides include an end-to-end analytics all the way from decarbonization pathways to grid operations and impact on consumers. Is extremely important because, as you see today, a lot of those utilities and system operators and concerned citizens, they don't have the tools from end to end to provide, and they approach decarbonization from different angles that can be inconsistent. That end-to-end analytics is very critical to bring the users and the long-term planners together in something in plans that are making sense. These end-to-end analytics also come with a number of technical breakthroughs. First, we're using decarbonization pathways developed with multi-sectoral models that provides global economies and interactions and a perfect with a strategic sequencing between decarbonization and electrification. That transparency is key for dialogue between the different sectors, industry, transportation, and so on, to understand the rates of that electrification. Another technical breakthrough is the use of climate intelligence to evaluate the resilience and the reliability of the power grid. With the power grid being more and more dependent on weather, we need to bring more weather, state-of-the-art weather and climate science for siting, sizing, and operating those new assets. We also have an equity research that is allowing us to understand the impact of decarbonization on the consumers. What's important here is that that research is compatible with the research that we are doing for the electricity providers. That also provides the dialogue. And one more thing that GODEEEP is providing is that we're empowering stakeholders. That's whether this is for the scenario, each data sets of wind, solar, hydro load, the method, tools, and data sets, they are all provided. Where it's important is that we created this platform that provides the infrastructure for sharing methods and data sets that are critical for our providers, utilities, system operators, independent producers, early investors to approach decision-making with different angles, but consistent and compatible information. And this is also empowering the consumers, the concerned citizens, legislators, regulators to evaluate the scenarios and provide feedback on which scenario might be more supported by the voters. In the rest of this presentation, we will focus on presenting the platform, how to access the platform, what to find, how to use it through different end use cases. And then that will be a sneak peek to the deep dive where you will be able to meet the experts and understand what is the science between each of those data sets and tools. So that brings us to the next slides. Thank you. So these slides represent what you will find in our platform. Consistent, open source, end-to-end framework with intermediate data sets and tools for customizations. And I'm going to say it a number of times, because even if one of the advances is to be able to provide this end-to-end analytics, and we know that that brings consistency between the users, our stakeholder engagement so far and our experience working in the industry is that there's always customization that needs to happen at each point of that platform. So this is really where it's important to be able to provide those intermediate data sets. So starting from the left-hand side, decarbonization starts with policy and climate. It means that it starts with a top-down approach. In this platform, you will find climate change scenarios combined with decarbonization policies. At this time, we are running two, just for a demonstration. And we process this information to project the sequencing of decarbonization and electrification between sectors, including global economies. Those data sets are available. For actionable information, such as investment or changes in operations, we are looking at the impact on providers, and we are looking at resource adequacy and reliability studies. We need a higher resolution in space, in time, and in sectors of activities. So first, we built on existent, consistent weather data sets that were developed under the Office of Science Multi-Sector Dynamics program. We then developed workflows, all reproducible. This allows us to develop those wind and solar and hydropower and load data sets that are all coincident and consistent and are scale relevant to the power system models and power system research questions. The fact that here all of those workflows are reproducible, as I mentioned, allows users to be able to figure out where they are and if they want to know more about those different places, or if those are data sets that they are interested in, or if they have the assumptions, or if the assumptions are aligned with their understanding of what they want to use. We evaluate the impact on power grid operations, which feeds into the environmental and energy equity and justice, which actually feeds back into the impact on the providers. So this is a qualitative framework, what you will find on our platform. So if you could go to the next one. That's our platform. This is a web-based platform for easy access. On this platform, you will find 4 tabs that represent our 4 pillars. Decarbonization pathways, resilience and reliability, and justice and equity. This is our anticipations of the different users with the different science questions. The back end is going to be found in resource and guidance. Even though you may have different end-use questions in our 3 tabs of decarbonization pathways, resilience, reliability, and justice and equity, the back end is consistent. And again, that's what you find in resource and guidance. So we're providing resource and guidance to access the tools and data sets and docs, and then all those 3 end-use cases where we describe in more details how you can do the analytics. So let me get you through this web-based platform. On the next slide, this is a snapshot of our resource and guidance page. We're still improving it. What is key on this page is that you can find the qualitative workflows. The qualitative workflows, they provide the big pictures to users on how the scenarios are evaluated. You're going to find state-of-the-art workflows. Those provide to the more interested users access to the tools and intermediate data sets, and making sure that this is what they need. If this is not what they need, they can actually access the data sets and the tools and tweak it and run it themselves, because it's open source and downloadable and documented. And then you will find data sets and analytics for any ready-to-use cases. That's not the prettiest slide at this time, but this is still the good slides where we can discuss our vision of success for this kickoff and for this initiative. In many ways, what we built is a platform or an infrastructure for test beds that allows agencies and industry to communicate and collaborate consistently because it's open source. And when we use it to downscale our decarbonization scenarios, we demonstrated this capability. A success for today's kickoff will be to share these visions with the agencies, the industries, the sponsors, with you all interested, to have you all interested in a deep dive, to learn more about how you and we can benefit from these end-to-end test beds over the Western US, which is generalizable to other interconnections. So that brings us to the next slide. So that's the current qualitative workflow, which is a level of detail higher than the roadmap. Walking you one more time through the platform, it's also the process we use to develop our end-to-end analysis. So you start from the upper left where you have the climate. And we're using the US DOE flagship model, GCAM, Global Climate Analysis Model, that provides this representation of regional to global multi-sectoral dynamics. The output from GCAM provides decarbonization pathways, allows to address a number of questions at the state level and testing policies. This is still at a pretty coarse resolution for impact on the providers. So we developed those series of models and reproducible workflows to address different questions from all of the users. So first, for the load, we are using the electricity load model called TEL. It's a machine learning based model that allows to go from an annual load projections to hourly time series at the scale of balancing authorities. Because it's machine learning based, it can reproduce complex dynamics in the past, but with the electrification of sectors and transportation in particular, we know that we need to address these disruptions in the load profile. So we developed that transportation electrification model that allows to address changes in charging strategy and adoptions, and also the sensitivity to temperature, which is going to be impacted under extreme events. We are also developing wind and solar data sets. Very often, representing wind and solar data sets has been seen as very computationally intensive. That is, but we're providing and we're leveraging some of the NREL models. We put them together so that for any downscale climate data sets, and here we're using specific climate data sets that I'm going to present next. We're going from complex atmospheric output that we bias correct, and we run through this workflow to develop those wind and solar hourly time series at the power plant scale. To understand where those power plants are going to be, we're actually using the plant siting model SURF. This is a high resolution siting model that is being informed by the decarbonization pathways. It's being informed by the availability of resources, by the load, by the prices to understand the economic opportunities, and also by equity research. Those siting plants now have an hourly time series of load and here generations that we can then pass to the grid operation model. The grid operation model, in this structure, we strategically decided to use a commercial production cost model called GridView, developed by Hitachi. The reason that we chose it is that then it means that we have ready to use and use cases for utilities that may not have the resources to evaluate or to ping on all of those different tool sets. I first want to get firsthand understand what it means for their research questions. Those are already in GridView. The grid responses are then also further evaluated by the equity research to understand the impact on jobs and incomes and reliability and energy affordability. So that's the qualitative framework that allows for different users to see what is their research questions and where they need to dig in to get access to the data and the workflows. So this is the qualitative workflows. And in the next slide, it's the more nerdy workflow. So for the users who are getting their hands dirty, this is the type of workflows that you're going to find state of the art, where you have a very clear descriptions of the data pipelines and the data flows. For each of them, so in green you have the data sets, in blue you have the model, and in orange you have the interface. The ready-to-use cases are on the very far right. So the grid view models and the grid view datasets are proprietary. So if you have a license, you can access it directly. If you want to use a different commercial model, or if you want to use a synthetic open source model, you can do it from the generator siting. You have this sited infrastructure at 1 square kilometer resolutions. And the serve to grid view, this model dataset, the serve to grid view script is actually also available so that you can benefit from this advance to then map it to your own nodes and database, and then being able to use whichever model you want. But at this time, you already have ready-to-use cases. On the left-hand side, you have all of those intermediate datasets for customization. Again, working with the industry at this time, every single time there were some assumptions to change or a different way to look at climate information. And so based on those workflows, you can go back in the process and take it from where you need to get it. So that's for the technical workflows. If you want to go to the next slide, that's a lot of data and that's a lot of models. So you may be worried right now of being pretty overwhelming. Yeah, we know we have those data and those models out there, but it's not working. Well, we've tested it. We've been leveraging state-of-the-art new software engineering to make sure that all of those workflows are reproducible and highly documented. So we provide NPs. We want to know how you use these workflows. We want to know how what you found out, and we want to be there to collaborate with you. We can't do everything, but we can ensure you that you will have a great start by using those workflows through the software engineering that we put in the back end to make sure that this is reproducible on your systems. If you go to the next slide. So what are the data sets that you can find at this time? On that resource and guidance webpage, you're going to find data sets you can see on the left. Those are, this is following the long-term planning from climate and decarbonizations and weather, all the way down to what you would need to run your production cost model with loads, siting infrastructure, wind and solar, hydropower, derating and outage, and then more for the equity research with population and income distribution. We have it across a number of very strategic scales. The state scales, balancing authority, that's very important for the load, siting infrastructure, and wind and solar, because those are the scale of the decision making. We also have it at the bus plant scales and at 1 square kilometers. Some of them are in progress, and they should be there by the end of the summer. And again, I want to emphasize that we had two scenarios at this time. We're using RCP 8.5 SSP5, and we're using one for business as usual, and a net zero without carbon capture sequestration by request from our industry stakeholders. And we have multiple infrastructure all the way from 2020 to 2050 on a 5-year timescale. So we have the 10, 20, and 30-year infrastructure lookout. Next. That's a lot of data. That's a lot of model. Thank you very much. How do we use them? So on top of this, that's what you're going to find on our 3 tabs, depending on where the users are. And those are some examples of analytics. Some of the questions that we got from our stakeholders were electrification of transport. We want to better understand what is the impact on the load profile. We want to understand the compound impact of the compound impact of those load profile and the modified sensitivity to air temperature. With all of science questions, with hypotheses on how extreme events and heat waves in particular are going to stress the grid, it's very important to get that edge and understand when the sectors are getting electrified, how this is compounding the impact of that on that grid stress. Other question that we got was on stranded assets. Stranded assets are when power plants to provide transitional reliability between now and 2035 and 2050, we still have to invest in some of the natural gas. However, they might not reach the end of their life due to early retirements. There's also potential for stranded assets, leveraging some of the equity research, where as we understand more about potential environmental and societal challenges to siting of power plants. So all of this research is impacting, and this is informing early investors on the stranded assets. When it comes to reliability and resource adequacy questions, a lot of questions and data sets that we got requests for are extreme event case studies. We know that the extreme events are getting worsened, heat waves in particular. What we've noticed is that across all of our users, whether you are utilities or regulator or system operators, there is a different language on how heat waves are being characterized. And we need to have a standardization of the severity, frequency, and impact across those users. So this is also some research that you're going to find on our platforms and in the deep dives. Energy droughts allow us to understand the potential grid vulnerabilities, with the grid being more and more weather reliant. Understanding coincident wind, solar, and temperature sensitive peak load events is critical to understand how to work on energy storage, especially siting, sizing, and operating. That's what we call climate intelligence. How to use the state-of-the-art climate intelligence that you can find operationally by climate data services, and then operate and size it for a more intelligent grid. Affordability, jobs, and incomes. We also have a deep dive on this type of research. We need to understand the detailed impact of decarbonization on energy affordability by income classes. If that energy is not affordable, then your load forecasts are not accurate. And this is part of the large uncertainties that we find in decarbonization scenarios. That social equity is vital, it's critical, and we have also a deep dive on that aspect. And finally, impacts on disadvantaged communities. We need to understand if there is a disproportionate impact on disadvantaged communities, but also understand potential opportunities from retired power plants in certain regions. All of those, and we're going to give a bit of some sneak peeks to get you interested. We're going to get some of the results, but please come to the deep dive to get more information on what's happening in the back end for those research questions. So the first deep dive is on June 26th. So we said that we would start from the qualitative workflow. So I think if you push one more, Stephanie, I think it's perfect. Thank you. So for this workflow, the focus on this deep dive is to look at the decarbonization scenarios and how the decarbonization of the power grid and the electrification of sectors is driving load projections. So that's what you have here on the upper left of this corner, where we're following on GCAM, the TEL, and the electricity model. If you go to the next slide. So on the upper left panel here, you're finding an example of the decarbonization pathways. You have seen likely a lot as a long-term planners. We're providing a transparency for our two business as usual and net zero scenarios. We have this explicit representation of the electrification of the industry and transport and that timeline. And then we have these projections of electricity generations between those two scenarios to understand how to provide how much energy generations to support the electrification of the sectors. We're using, again, which I said, the US DOE flagship model called GCAM to provide those sectoral annual load projection by state. We also need to get the climate, actually the weather. And on the upper right, you can see what we call the TGW datasets. Those datasets, you will see that there are actually multiple climate change datasets. The downscaling is key to address specific science questions. In our engagement with stakeholders, very often the questions we get are, what about the heat dome that we had in 2021? Is it going to happen again? And how much worse is it going to be under climate change conditions? So this data sets and the downscaling we use, this dynamical downscaling, it's providing and addressing exactly that question. So you have this historical heat waves, but then we reproduce it under future conditions. And we have all of the meteorological data to get to the wind, solar, and load, and so on. Focusing on the load, we're using the electricity load model TEL that I mentioned earlier. It's a machine learning base that we enhance with a transportation electricity model to get that edge on understanding the new sensitivity to temperature and get better peak load. And so that's the graph that you have on the right, where you have a heat wave passing through and you can see the evolutions across each of the balancing authority. Passing it to Stephanie.
Okay, so our second deep dive will be on July 10th. It's going to be focusing on the societal and natural resource impacts on the feasibility of siting of new infrastructure required under these decarbonization scenarios. This webinar will describe the methods and underlying modeling that takes into account equity considerations and potential on-the-ground challenges that would come into play when evaluating potential infrastructure siting decisions. This deep dive will cover the models and workflows, including the use of state-level capacity expansion required to achieve the net zero emissions targets that come from our flagship Human Earth System model, the Global Change Analysis model. The use of production cost modeling for wholesale energy prices and siting decisions, geospatial modeling of technology-specific natural resource, land use, and policy siting constraints, economic optimization of siting decisions in the face of these constraints to minimize net locational costs, which is the net interconnection costs and energy values in particular locations. Also connecting infrastructure siting with equity considerations. So the end result of this modeling is a high resolution visualization and data set that can support the inclusion of equity into the evaluation of infrastructure siting decisions and to identify the degree to which different technologies may face local opposition to siting due to a wide range of potential issues such as nearby protected lands, water availability, endangered species, etc.
In that third deep dive is where we're addressing a bit more the climate intelligence and the vulnerability of the decarbonized grid to energy droughts and climate extremes. So we are focusing on this range of models. So the load, the wind and solar and hydro, and the sited infrastructure. The questions that we are addressing is really understanding, again, that future vulnerability of the grid when all the wind and the solar are low and we have a peak in temperature. If we go into the next slide. So as Stephanie mentioned, in all of those deep dives, you're going to be able to get an understanding of where those data sets are, how they've been developed, and then have a couple of those end use cases. On the left here, you can see some of the workflows that we use to develop those wind and solar data sets that are being made available. And the data sets on the upper left here, it's only for 5 balancing authorities, but those are available across the entire continental US. So the things to mention and to notice here is the seasonal patterns for each of those wind and solar data sets across balancing authorities. Those have applications to seasonal storage questions. The part on the right here is some of the research that we have done at a shorter timescales. We use those wind and solar and load data sets that are coincident. I'm going to mention it a number of times. I'm going to say that this is why you need a hydrologist in your team for long-term planning. The wind and solar and the temperature base, there's a lot of different techniques to develop them and downscale them. When you use a hydrology model, when those don't have the climate structure, you don't get the flow that you're expecting. And that's the point. And that's we're using this expertise to evaluate those energy droughts. If you don't have this coincidence between them, all of your energy droughts are going to be very average, but we want to have the extremes. So we've been analyzing them, and in particular, we've been standardizing how we talk about energy droughts across those different regions. And some of our early results here on the upper right are showing those energy droughts where each of the dots represent the number of events per year. This is energy drought research based on 2020 infrastructure and historical climates. And with the colors, it's the drought duration. So for example, for the California, for California ISO, you can expect 5 events per year at this time. And there is a 90% chance that they're going to last up to 5 days. Those energy droughts are based, we remove the seasonal patterns, which allow us to really focus on the management of storage from hourly to a couple days. So that's a difference from the seasonal storage design. Here, this is really the intraday to a couple days storage, and that has a lot of impact on understanding incentives, market incentives that should go for a number of days and understanding those timescales. And that has also impact on where to put storage. I said that we were using balancing authorities. This is on purpose. The balancing authorities, this is where you need to balance the wind and the load and the temperature. Before saying that this is a vulnerability, we will have to use in the future research, we're going to get through it with the power grid models so that we can understand this coincidence effect between the balancing authority and what's the role of transmissions between storage. We're also going to do it under future infrastructure, but this is our deep dive in July and community expert in July. We're also getting a number of questions from our users and partners on how to develop extreme events, and some of our heat waves scenarios with, again, coincident wind and solar are also already being used as is by the National Transmission Planning Studies. And we're also working with the WEC. Here, with the WEC, we are customizing our data. I think I've been mentioning it. Every time we work with the different industry partners, there are very different assumptions. So we are leveraging our platforms to go back into our workflows and be able to extract the information they need. And so just another example on our data sets are being used. So please come again, more details on July 24th for that.
So our fourth deep dive is on August 7th. And in this one, we're going to delve more deeply into the effects of decarbonization transitions and climate change on equity and energy justice. So all of the things you see in this bottom row highlighted. In this deep dive, we're going to share the models and methods used to develop multiple metrics of equity and energy security across several spatial, temporal, and socioeconomic scales. This work again begins with GCAM USA scenarios that were used to provide the projections of the necessary capacity expansion used to achieve the net zero targets. But this version of GCAM USA that we use in GODEEEP has a special feature, and we're modeling energy demand for 10 different income deciles, where the income deciles are the level of income for each 10% of the population in every state. This is a pretty unique feature that allows us to explore different metrics of energy security and how different groups of people would be impacted depending on their income. So these metrics that we're using include energy expenditure as a share of income and things like the satiation gap for different energy services. So for heating service, this is essentially how far below comfort levels different consumer groups might be when they're heating their homes. So we also use changes in industry output from GCAM USA and SURF infrastructure siting to develop scenarios for IMPLAN, which is an input-output model, which we then use to project changes in jobs by industry and income levels at the census block level, which is a pretty fine resolution. These jobs and income projections are used to explore potential changes in DAC status, so including the likelihood of a community moving into or out of disadvantaged status depending on these changes. Deep Dive 4 is also going to showcase our energy justice visualization and impact analysis tool. EJVIA is a major component of GODEEEP. It's a platform for analyzing and visualizing results across many scales. So spatially across regional, state, and census block levels, temporally going through 2050, and socioeconomics, looking at different income deciles, DAC status, and non-DAC status. This tool also allows us to explore many different metrics, including power plant emissions, so how different areas are see changes in SOx, NOx, PM 2.5, and how different groups might have different levels of exposure. Changes in power plant locations, the new operational and retired plants, and again, spatially to be able to overlay this with DAC and non-DAC status, looking at unserved energy levels and wholesale electricity costs. So now turning, we finished up with our deep dives, and I want to note that while GODEEEP is a PNNL lab-directed research and development project, it's designed to align with DOE fundamental and applied programs and other agencies' priorities related to justice and equity. So for example, the DOE Office of Science Multi-Sector Dynamics program has supported many of the open source models that are being leveraged in this research. PNNL expertise in the modeling of human Earth system interactions and feedbacks has greatly benefited from the long-term support of this program. Of particular relevance to GODEEEP are the models and research related to climate and technology drivers and socioeconomic dynamics rather. But GODEEEP has been able to further develop these models to create stakeholder-facing and stakeholder-informed tools. This research then helps to inform future fundamental research and or the research to operations to research platform. Oops, sorry, Natalie.
I'm just going to reiterate a little bit what Stephanie said, especially here on the right side. You have roadmap for on the applied side of the US Department of Energy. The initiative builds on that PNNL technical leadership, contributing to those roadmaps across fundamental and applied research offices. We could spend some time on the one-to-one mapping. We would like to invite our sponsors at this time to have a follow-up meeting. We would love to discuss more about how those technical advances could accelerate those individual roadmaps. The important aspect to bring forward is that we develop these platforms or infrastructure for test beds that allows agencies and industry to communicate and collaborate on climate change and decarbonization. GODEEEP is a little bit like NORM, focusing on one aspect of NORM toolchain though, but with a strategic combinations of open source models and one proprietary model. GODEEEP bridged the gap between the fundamental and the applied research in climate, equity, and power system models. Another example, but more on the Office of Science side, would be AHTM, the Integrated Hydroterrestrial Model, as we collaborate across fundamental and applied research to accelerate the science of research to operation back to research. GODEEEP is a demonstration of such that test bed. So that brings us to the last slide. So as a summary, through this initiative, we developed technical advance to represent the impact of climate change and climate extremes on the grid, how to use climate intelligence to operate the grid, and how equity research can inform on the adoptions of decarbonization scenarios. Specifically, the technical advance of allowing consumers and providers and agencies to communicate and collaborate on decarbonizations. And we made those advances operational and accessible for research. So those are our 4 pillars, and we are I really want to thank all of the entire team. There are about 50 staff of very different scientific expertise that have been contributing to it. And so we are very excited for your questions and feedbacks on how we can accomplish these visions with you all of having long-term planners, providers, and consumers working together and consistently on decarbonization. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie, Natalie, and we're going to move into the Q&A part of the meeting. And I've been monitoring the chat, and I think I will, let's see, Michael Levy, or perhaps it's Levy, asked an initial question for more details about energy droughts, and perhaps Natalie's slide on that answered your questions, but you also asked, and this would, I think, go to Natalie, does the production cost model include transmission constraints, and is it nodal or zonal?
Thank you. Thanks for the question. Let me provide a bit more details. The production cost model that we use is grid view. This is a nodal representations with the full resolution. So we have the full representation of all of the constraints. Transmissions is going to, and the congestions is going to be some of the data that we are looking into. For the energy droughts and how we're defining them, this is something that I say that we were standardizing it. So focusing on the relatively short-term heat waves, there are heat waves that we characterize as hourly. So how many straight hours of very low wind and solar do you have? And we used a threshold of 10%. 10% of that, if you're in April, for the second week of April, we are looking at the climatology, and the lower 10% of that climatology is the threshold that we're using at this time. This is a standardization, and we will also following up with some sensitivity analysis to understand when we need to have 10% for wind and 30% for solar, for example. That's something that we're also going to look into. Does that address your question?
Michael, if you want to raise your hand, we can unmute you if you have a follow-up clarifying question. And this is Michael L. Just wait a minute. No, not Michael Kindermeyer. Not yet, Michael. Not that Michael. We got a few people ahead of you in the queue. All right. I will go to a question from David McCollum next. David was curious about whether we are focusing on the Western US in GODEEEP.
Should I take that one? So initially, as a demonstration, we're focused on the Western US, but the methodology that we've developed can be expanded nationally. But the choice was made to take one region initially as a study region to develop these methods. So yes, everything you'll see online as we get more detailed is focused on the US, but all of the GCAM USA results are available for every state.
Actually, I think we can, just to complement what you say, is so the GCAM USA is over the entire continental US. The load, the wind, the solar, the hydro, it's also at the continental US. When it comes to the grid operations, it's that being the Western US when we run grid view. So we're starting to be at the scale of the interconnection. And then when it comes to some of the social equity research, then we start going to social and equity scales. So we also have deep dives then over the Washington states or your finding census block.
Thanks, Natalie.
Okay, I am following the chat questions in the order they've come up. So Terrence Hill, will the role of city block microgrids aggregating energy plus residences be part of this program? I think we have to give that one to Natalie.
So sorry, repeating the questions, is city blocks microgrid?
Right. Will microgrids be part of the modeling in this, in GODEEEP?
Well, GODEEEP is a 2-year initiative, so I can't say microgrid is not part of the scope at this time. However, this is something that we are seeing that I think it's broader than GODEEEP. It's more the entire community here for long-term planning is going to be the representation of power system models over what is the next generation of production cost model, and the representation of centralized and decentralized and microgrid. So that's not part of GODEEEP, but all of the data sets that we are providing, I do hope that they're going to promote the development of those models and actually unlock this research, because I agree that we should look more into it.
Okay, the next question is from Ken Wilson, and I think I'll probably answer part of this question. It says, how much collaboration is taking place with the modeling being done by DOE? Are PNNL scientists in the DOE meetings and are DOE modelers in PNNL meetings? So I'll just start out by saying, from an Office of Science, DOE Office of Science perspective, GODEEEP is leveraging many of the tools that have been funded by the Multi-Sector Dynamics program area. So the electricity load modeling, power plant siting, GCAM model. So these are all tools which are being enhanced and tailored for GODEEEP. And let me turn it over to Stephanie and Natalie if they'd like to add on to that.
I'm just not sure I got the question right.
The question is just how much collaboration is there with DOE is on GODEEEP, and okay. Are we talking to DOE, I think is the sense. And Ken Wilson, if you want to raise your hand to clarify, we can unmute you.
And else I can start talking about, you know, as Jenny was mentioning, we are, a lot of the tools are leveraging Office of Science. Actually, a lot of the tools are also leveraging the work that we do on the applied office. So for example, as part of, I work a lot with HydroWires, which is the Water Power Technology Office. And we've been challenging the way that we represent water in the production cost model. All of those projects are multi-labs and also working with the industry. So this research is very, is meant to be collaborative and meant to be helping also other labs work on it with us moving forward.
All right, I'll go to another question, and again, we can open the mics if people need to ask clarifying or follow-up questions. This is from Brian O'Neill. It seems that GODEEEP is focused on the tools and the platform to allow lots of analyses to be done, but it also has its own scenarios. In those scenarios, did you get an initial sense of how substantial the equity impacts of decarbonization could be? And that probably goes to Stephanie.
Sure. So we are in the process of doing those. The equity work is, you know, we have to step through it. And so as we've gotten the infrastructure and siting projections done, we are moving that into the equity space, the equity analysis. But in our initial work that we've done on energy security metrics, we have seen some fairly substantial changes on the lower income groups in terms of the share of income expenditures on share of income, energy expenditure share of income, and the satiation gap, which I mentioned earlier, which is for, you know, a given energy service, how far below kind of the ideal would consumers be. So, you know, as their situation is changing, prices are changing, do we see decreases in heating consumption to levels below which, you know, the consumers would like to be at, you know, ideal situation. And, you know, under the policy scenario that we've done so far, we do see some substantial changes for the lower income groups.
And another equity-related question, and I'm going to apologize up front for getting the pronunciation wrong, from Flor de Lisa de Peralta. The question is, are U.S. territories included in this project? Because those are where energy equity is really challenged.
We have not yet expanded the analysis to U.S. territories.
Okay, a couple other questions. How do GODEEEP's projections of electricity demands compare to other data sets out there? For example, the NREL electrification future study.
I can take that one. We're in the same ballpark. It's typically a bit hard to do apples to apples comparison because there is a lot that goes into those projections. But our business, as the usual case, is comparable to the NREL studies, base values, and also similar to what the WEC is using for their 2042 anchor data set. The net zero is slightly different, and we need to note that we're also using different time horizons for decarbonization. So that's where for the WEC, for example, we're using 2042. But in our projections, we're using 2040 and 2045 and 2050. So that's where it gets hard sometimes to do some apples to apples comparisons, but we are in the same ballpark. We mentioned too is that the unique capabilities of GODEEEP is that we are developing and we are downscaling those projections into those hourly time series at the balancing authority level, meaning that the way that we are downscaling it, we are not using the same weights from one infrastructure year to another. We're actually using dynamic weights, which is one of the good part of our projections of electricity demands. Oh, please come on June 26th because Casey Burleson is going to talk in details about all of those data sets.
All right, we have just a few more questions here. How could GODEEEP's research provide support for state agency needs to direct decarbonization investments to disadvantaged communities?
Could you repeat the question, Jenny? I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah, this is an equity related one. So how could GODEEEP's research help state agencies direct decarbonization investments to disadvantaged communities? Yeah,
in a couple of different ways. I think there's a broader federal level analytical capability we have here with using the provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act to look at impacts for different income groups that, using GCAM with the developments we have for looking at multiple income groups. And then on the finer spatial scales, like I said, there's the ability to look at how jobs and incomes may potentially change at these very fine resolutions at the census block level. And then using the EJVIA tool, there's ways to visualize across all of these impacts. But it's a tough challenge, or it's tough to say exactly how these could be used for state regulators because there aren't clear guidelines in what needs to be done. So as I mentioned earlier, sometimes the regulations about inclusion of considerations of energy justice. So considering these is not clear exactly what needs to be done. So we're providing information, and then we would need to work with regulators and utilities to see exactly what their needs are, because we don't have clear guidance yet on what those needs are.
All right, and another question on energy droughts from Cameron Bracken. How do wind and solar energy droughts vary across the CONUS?
They vary. They vary. There's a lot. It's a climate scale. We do know that we have a number of different climate regions across the continental US. As part of those different climate regions, we have different seasons. So we do know that at the seasonal scales, we do have different needs for very long-term storage. When you go to a shorter time scale from intradays to multiple days, we're also seeing some differences, although it's a bit more subtle. For example, we do find that over Texas, this is where we have the longest observed droughts at an hourly timescale. So straight number of hours with very low wind. So very little ability to recharge. We're counting to about 37 hours. However, at the daily drought, it's going to be longer in California, where we can find those droughts can last from 2 to 6 days. So they are not as intense. There might be some ability to recharge over a couple hours, but those are really a number of days where it's pretty low. I'm actually going to go into more details as well on that. I think it's July 24 for this one.
Stephanie, it might be good to advance the slide so we can remind folks about the deep dive dates.
Yep.
And I think we have answered all the questions in the chat. If anybody would like to pose a question verbally instead of typing it, please just raise your hand and we will unmute you. And while you're thinking about that, I do want to encourage everyone to put these deep dives on your calendar. They should be really, really interesting, and you will be able to interact directly with the researchers who have their hands in the weeds, so to speak, of this research. And I'll just wait a couple minutes to see if anybody would like to ask another question. But we really appreciate everyone's attendance here and hope to interact with you as we move forward. And I will let Natalie and Stephanie say a final word if they would like.
I just want to add my thanks to Jenny's and say we really appreciate everybody's time and the interest that's been shown so far. And we look forward to talking with all of you further and seeing you at the deep dives.
I just add a thank you for all of the teams that have been working very hard in putting all of those data sets and workflows for you today. And they're really also eager to meet with all of you for giving more insights on the science behind what they've done in those deep dives. Thank you so much for all of your interest, and please follow up.
Thank you. And we will be making the recording of this meeting available and the slides available. I posted about that in the chat earlier. You can come back to the registration link shown here to also get that additional information about this webinar and the upcoming webinars. So we will wrap up a little bit early here. I'm sure no one will complain about having 20 minutes back in their day. And thank you all so much for your questions, and we look forward to seeing you again in 2 weeks. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.